Thank you all very much for coming today to see Matthew Kirshenbaum speak. My name is Lori Emerson. I'm an assistant professor in the English department, and I feel very fortunate to have had a small role to play in bringing Matt here. So throughout the year, the Atlas Institute hosts distinguished visitors from academia, industry, art, and various other areas as part of an exploration of the ways in which technologies are shaping society. These presentations are an important resource, of course, for CU students, for faculty, and for the Atlas community in general to discuss the opportunities, discoveries, and innovative applications of technology today. So we are very grateful for the generosity of Edith Harrell-Caperton and Anat Harrell in supporting the Atlas Speaker Series. We're also fortunate to have had support from a number of different departments across CU in bringing Matt to campus. So I would like to gratefully acknowledge the Department of English, the ICJMT initiative, the University Library ScriptaLab, and Friends of the Libraries. All these units co-sponsored this visit. So this afternoon we are again very pleased to welcome Matthew Kirshenbaum. Matthew is an associate professor in the Department of English at the University of Maryland. He's also associate director of the Maryland Institute for Technology and the Humanities, otherwise known as MITH, and MITH is an applied think tank for the digital humanities. His first book was titled Mechanisms, New Media and the Forensic Imagination. It received several awards, including the 2009 Richard J. Finneran Award from the Society for Textual Scholarship. Matt's work has also started to receive a lot of attention from the press, such as The Atlantic, New York Times, Wired, Boing Boing, and Slashdot. In 2011, Matt was a Guggenheim Fellow, which made possible, allowed for him to concentrate for a block of time on his current book project, which is called Track Changes, A Literary History of Word Processing. And so his talk this afternoon is going to draw on this current work and the questions of technology, content, and writing at the intersection of literary and technological history. So please give our speaker, Matt Kirshenbaum, a warm welcome.
Thank you, Laurie. Hello, everyone. Thank you. It's great to be here, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank once again the people who were involved in hosting me, Laurie Emerson, who you just heard from, Stephanie Wanek here at Atlas, as well as James Asher in the library, and Atlas itself for hosting the libraries, the Department of English, Journalism. So I really appreciate it. I've had a great day out here so far. Is the microphone okay? Is that volume okay? It sounds a little bit loud in my own ears. I'm good? Okay. So as Laurie mentioned, what I'm going to do is share with you some of the work that's going into my current book in progress, which is entitled Track Changes, and the subtitle is A Literary History of Word Processing, and that's really what the project is all about. It's to document and accumulate what we can know about the process by which writers came to this new technology. And so the talk is in 4 parts. It runs for about 50 minutes, and my understanding is we'll have some time for questions afterwards. On March 20th, 1981, the New York Times op-ed page carried a brief item musing that historians and biographers might soon be in for, quote, slim pickings. What precipitated this pronouncement was a report that Jimmy Carter, just months out of office and hard at work on his memoirs for Bantam, had lost several pages of text after hitting the wrong keys on his brand new $12,000 linear word processor. Word processing, the Times speculated, threatened to put historians, quote, those bloodhounds of the paper trail, out of business. Archivists, meanwhile, the Times continued, will be deprived of words scratched out, penciled in, and transposed with wandering arrows. They will have to make do with electronically perfect texts. President Carter was eventually able to retrieve his deleted prose with assistance from the manufacturer. And ironically, the Lanier, which was one of several high-end systems on the market, was advertised as the no-problem word processor. That was the branding. But what can it mean that 30 years ago, this incident rose to the attention of the New York Times? The op-ed, written at a moment when authors, editors, journalists, and publishers were still very much in the midst of transitioning to the new technology, put its finger on one of the defining aspects of this new kind of text. Its smooth, seemingly seamless perfection, its crisp, luminescent characters, somehow there and not there on just the other side of the screen. Beneath that cool, clean surface, however, we find a different story. It was not always a given that computer text processing, as it was also then called, would be a tool for poets and novelists, for essayists and ex-presidents, as well as for office assistants, paralegals, and technical writers. The story of writing in the digital age is every bit as messy as the ink-stained rags that would have littered Gutenberg's print shop or the hot molten lead of the linotype machine. It's a story that contains many stories, and as stories go, many of them are pretty fabulous. So here are just a few. In 1968, Len Dayton, who had made a reputation writing espionage thrillers in Great Britain, alongside of culinary columns for the London Observer, leased a 200-pound piece of IBM office equipment called the Magnetic Tape Selectric Typewriter to aid in revising the manuscript drafts for his novel Bomber. As is so often the case, it was not Dayton himself who used the machine, but rather his secretary and typist, Mrs. Eleanor Handley. She recalls, Len lived in a Georgian terrace house, and the process of getting the MTST in the house was an all-day affair, necessitating removing windows and a mobile crane. And you see it there. Jerry Pournelle, a science fiction novelist and columnist for Byte magazine and eventual speechwriter for Newt Gingrich, was writing on a Z80 microcomputer using a program called Electric Pencil by 1977. Today, that machine is in the Smithsonian. It's not on display. It's unfortunately in a cabinet, but I did go and visit it, and you see Zeke, as he calls it, there. A few years later, Frank Herbert, author of Dune, published a treatise on computer word processing that was unabashedly written with a typewriter. Screenwriter Bonnie McBird, working on the movie Tron, arranged a visit to Xerox PARC. There she met a computer scientist named Alan Kay, who invited her to return to use the Alto computer and its revolutionary Bravo WYSIWYG text editor to revise the script. She and Alan Kay, who's a very famous computer scientist, later married. And Tron, fittingly enough, becomes the first screenplay to have been written on a computer. Stanley Elkin, hands and handwriting crippled by multiple sclerosis, was given a Lexitron word processor by Washington University, St. Louis in 1979. He immediately dubbed it the Bubble Machine and wrote 5 more novels with it. Tom Clancy, still a simple country insurance agent from Calvert County, Maryland, finished revising his breakthrough 1984 techno-thriller, The Hunt for Red October, on a shiny new Apple II he bought with his advance money. The computer and software then got a cameo in the book. George R.R. Martin of Game of Thrones fame still uses WordStar to this day. Anne Rice's postmodern vampire Lestat chose WordStar to write his memoirs. And here at UC-Boulder, Adam Bradley has painstakingly documented Ralph Ellison's purchase of an Osborne computer like this one in 1982. Ellison immediately began revising sections of his long-in-progress second novel, sections of the manuscript that he hadn't touched in decades. Famously, he never finished the book. Judy Grom, though, tells me that her Exxon word processor saved her a full year's worth of work when writing Another Mother Tongue, her breakthrough cultural history of gay life published in the early years of the AIDS epidemic, and she considers that additional year vital to the book's impact. Stephen King and Peter Straub both bought their first word processors so they could collaborate long distance on writing The Talisman. King, who claimed it made crossouts and carets obsolete, published a short story in Playboy called The Word Processor of the Gods. Novelist Mona Simpson tells about how she was tipped off to the existence of the Macintosh by her estranged brother with whom she had recently been reunited. His name, Steve Jobs. Jacques Derrida found repeated occasions to write about his succession of Macintosh computers, or Le Petit Mac, as he affectionately termed them. Charles Bukowski got a Macintosh in 1991. His already prodigious output soared, even as he dragged his cantankerous self to night classes to master its secrets. And what you're looking at there is a Robert Crumb cartoon, and the caption is quite wonderful. Old writer puts on sweater, sits down, leers into computer, or perhaps it's leans into computer screen, and writes about life. How holy can we get? Finally, Salman Rushdie has confided that he began writing on a laptop during the Fatwa period so that he could pack up his work in progress on short notice if necessary. And those are his actual computers, which are now in the Special Collections Department at Emory University. So today, computers and word processors, not to mention smartphones, PDAs, and social media, are all commonplace accessories of the writing life. Some writers use the same consumer electronics you and I do. Others pimp or modify their gear. Jonathan Franzen reportedly works on a stripped-down Dell laptop with its internet connection purposefully glued shut, and no games or entertainment programs, not even the ubiquitous Solitaire. Now, there are exceptions, of course. Don DeLillo still writes using a typewriter, as does Cormac McCarthy, as does Paul Auster. But even writers who continue to compose in longhand are inevitably surrounded by the digital detritus related to their correspondence, platform and public image, and critical reception. Nor is the decision about a computer simply a binary, to use or not to use. Often workflows are more nuanced. Michael Ondaatje is reputed to write his many drafts longhand, which indeed he does, but he also eventually sits down in front of Microsoft Word to revise yet again, and using an electronic text prepared by an assistant from his verbal dictation. J.K. Rowling composes longhand but revises on a laptop. Richard Powers now eschews the keyboard entirely, dictating drafts with voice recognition software while lying prone, and later tapping revisions on a tablet PC. There are many examples, and I could go on, and indeed I would love to, but when it comes to word processing, there's very little in the way of organized literary history. Fields like the history of the book, as well as the history of publishing and authorship, have paid scant attention to word processing, perhaps because it's assumed to be nothing more than a kind of high-tech typewriter. Occasionally, textual scholarship prompts some intervention, as has been the case with Adam Bradley's work on Ellison, or Doug Reside and the libretto for Jonathan Larson's musical Rent. Digital media studies, including its most recent iterations in software studies and media archaeology, has also generally had little to say about word processing, perhaps because as a software genre, it simply does not seem very interesting. You probably won't be surprised to learn that over the course of the last year, researching and writing this book entitled Track Changes, I've come to a different conclusion. Now, we can pinpoint with admirable precision the first typewritten manuscript submitted to a publisher by an established person of letters, and that distinction belongs to Mark Twain's Life on the Mississippi, published in 1882 and composed with his Remington No. 2. I was the first person in the world to apply the type machine to literature, he tells us, in a sketch written some years later, and adopted as an ad by the company, which was otherwise, of course, known as a manufacturer of firearms. But what do we know about the first literary manuscript composed with a word processor? Who were the early adopters, and how did they think about the technology? These questions, I would submit, are of more than just anecdotal interest. We incline to identify writers with their instruments and implements, often with good reason. Henry James followed Twain and became famously so enamored of the sound of the keys that the typewriter came to function as a kind of metronome. He reportedly couldn't compose without its rhythmic counterpoint. Ironically, he also may have contracted one of the first documented cases of repetitive strain injury. Jack Kerouac famously typed on the road on long sequential rolls of paper. "That's not writing, that's typing," Truman Capote admonished him. Nietzsche and Heidegger both wrote about their typewriters, and Nietzsche's use of the machine, in fact, predated Twain's, though he never completed a manuscript on it, only broken aphoristic musings. One of these is often quoted in histories of texts and technology. Our writing tools are also working on our thoughts. That word processing is perhaps most succinctly understood as the apotheosis of typing, the seemingly inevitable outcome of zooming up the technology curve between Christopher Latham Scholz's first Remington design, brought to market in 1874, and the advent of the personal computer roughly a century later, is surely due in no small measure to the latter's visual resemblance to a typewriter. There is a keyboard, after all, and there's a screen behind and laterally perpendicular to the keyboard, much as a sheet of paper curls out of the back of the rollers. However, the two best recent scholarly commentators on typewriting, Lisa Gittleman and Darren Werschler-Henry, both resist that linear causal narrative. Gittleman by citing typewriting laterally, within a much broader constellation of late 19th century media technologies and inscriptive practices, ranging from shorthand to telegraphy to recorded sound and even electric light. And Werschler-Henry teasing out the typewriter's alignment and alliances amongst the avant-garde, no less than the great patriarch Burroughs has typewriters, adding machines, and indeed computers in his family closet. William S. Burroughs, of the same Burroughs brand of office calculation equipment. Werschler-Henry seeks to sidestep the long shadow of Frederick Kittler by maintaining computing is neither typewriting's goal nor its conclusion. But both Gittleman and Werschler-Henry's projects stop short of any extended engagement with the history of writing in the computer era, and so that's where I pick up today. While we may not find strict causality, we do find more than casual continuities in the way the writing machine, be it a Remington or a Macintosh, serves to focalize anxieties and aspirations around information, inscription, and the authorial imagination. Perfect. No other word so encapsulates the aspirations and anxieties that accrued around early word processing. We remember WordPerfect, of course, which dominated the market from the mid-1980s through the early 1990s. But there were also now forgotten programs like LetterPerfect for the Atari 800 and Perfect Writer for the K-Pro. Perfect was the word the New York Times chose when ruminating about the kind of texts word processors would bequeath to posterity, and it is a word that figures prominently in early discussions of the technology. With the word processing system, writes Ivan Flores in his 1983 word processing handbook, you can actually produce a perfect document. Peter McWilliams, meanwhile, for his word processing book, swiped a woodcut from Doré to represent the beatific vision of divine perfection that awaited the traveler in the new electronic Empyrean. Etymologically, perfect comes to us from the Latin perfectus by way of Old French. The Latin meaning also encompasses the idea of completeness, the state of fullness or of being finished. The familiar hand gesture, index finger bent to touch tip of thumb, other fingers stiffened in accent, is a way of visualizing that condensed state of ripeness, the attainment of closure and completion. In the word processing milieu, perfect was meant to connote at the very least the image of a finished text flawlessly formatted, immaculately printed, and cleanly and clearly expressed. The sense of completion, meanwhile, also spoke to the desire for efficiency and productivity. This dual ideal, flawless efficiency, was present from the very inception of the word processing concept. In 1971, a scientific management consultant, named Walter A. Kleinschrod produced the first consolidated report on word processing for the American Management Association. The touch of a button, he wrote, triggers a perfect final copy. A second AMA text published a few years later echoed and embellished this language. The typist can push a button and the machine tirelessly and flawlessly chugs out a perfect draft, once, twice, 100 times if required, without fatigue or the errors fatigue can bring. Error was the arch enemy of perfection. Errors, mistakes, typos, revisions, the messy pencil scratches and wandering arrows invoked by the Times, Stephen King's crossouts and carrots, the caked-up layers of correction fluid and patches of paper rubbed raw by erasures, all of these disrupted the smooth, homogeneous surface of the professional document. So obsessed were early office managers with the pernicious influence of error on efficiency that entire studies were commissioned, the habits of typists scrutinized at the most minute levels. It was known, for example, that a secretary making a mistake in the first few lines of the page was likely to remove it and feed in a fresh sheet and start anew. A mistake introduced further down the page, however, would be attacked by the eraser. It was known how long the rubbing and retyping would take, along with the erasure and correction of any carbons associated with the original page. And of course, it was known how much all this cost. Cost in paper, cost in carbons, cost in erasers, and above all, cost in time. From the outset, then, the introduction of word processing into the modern office environment in the early 1970s was bound up with an interlocking array of marketing calculations, scientific management regimens, information proliferation anxieties, and even emancipatory claims with regard to something called women's lib, quote unquote. As computer historians point out, word processing was not primarily a technological innovation. The actual technologies had been pioneered decades earlier, but rather an organizational and a philosophical one, a manifestation of the kind of futurism that was of a piece with the push-button lifestyle, and indeed food processing introduced to consumers by the Cuisinart at just about the same time. Word processing restructured work, reclassified roles in the workforce, relocated people in the workplace, and reconfigured the individual workstation, all under the guise of centralizing and automating the composition, transcription, reproduction, and distribution, the processing and perfection of the printed word on paper. Yet the ideal of perfection, so seductive in an office setting, signaled something different in literary contexts. Some authors were not intimidated and indeed embraced it. Stanley Elkin, for example, quote, "The word processor enables one to concentrate exponentially. You have absolute command of the entire novel at once. You can go back and reference and change and fix and do so in a way such that all novels written on the bubble machine ought to be perfect novels," end quote. For others, however, word processing and the perfection of text doubtless evoked the specter of something like Italo Calvino's Organization for the Electronic Production of Homogenized Literary Works. There was no shortage of anti-word processing screeds and essays once the technology became commonplace in the early 1980s. Sometimes these came from surprising quarters. Science fiction novelist John Varley wrote one called The Unprocessed Word. In it, he stipulated that all future editions of his book should be imprinted with a logo attesting that the text was, quote, "created using only natural ingredients, the purest paper, carbon typewriter ribbons, pencils, ballpoint pens, thought, and creativity." He goes on in this vein, and if you look closely at the logo, you'll see it's two typewriter keys intertwined, because typewriters and carbon and ballpoint pens, we know these things are natural and not technology. Gore Vidal was more succinct. The idea of literature, he wrote in the New York Times Review of Books in 1984, is being erased by the word processor. Of course, there was a lot besides word processing to blame for that. This was an era of massive and wrenching upheavals in the publishing and bookselling industries. In New York, the seemingly constant consolidation amongst former rival publishing houses was reaching its apex. in retail chain stores like Walden Books, B. Dalton, and Barnes & Noble were all becoming commonplace fixtures in the shopping malls, while Borders was still just a locally operated bookstore on South State Street in Ann Arbor, albeit one with an innovative new computer-controlled inventory system. The chains, in turn, placed unprecedented stress on publishing lists, creating the demand for celebrity writers commanding unprecedented advances, writers like Tom Clancy and Stephen King, who could deliver a consistent, just-in-time product. James Patterson was then already on his way to becoming the most prolifically publishing novelist in America. Patterson, by the way, claims not to use a word processor, though his stable of assistants and ghostwriters do. Responses to word processing cut across the literary spectrum. Michael Crichton, not surprisingly a tech enthusiast, published a 1983 nonfiction volume, The Electronic Life, How to Think About Computers. For the English professors in the room, in 1985, the Modern Language Association took the unprecedented step of endorsing a name-brand piece of software to its membership. Its recommendation, Nota Bene, a word processing program that had been created by a graduate student in philosophy at Yale. In a now infamous piece published in 1987 in the New England Review, Wendell Berry laid out exactly why he was not going to buy a computer, Berry, of course, being the famous Kentucky poet. Quote, "My wife types my work on a Royal Standard typewriter bought new in 1956 and as good now as it was then. As she types, she sees things that are wrong and marks them with small checks in the margins. She is my best critic because she is the one most familiar with my habitual errors and weaknesses. She also understands, sometimes better than I do, what ought to be said. We have, I think, a literary cottage industry that works well and pleasantly. I do not see anything wrong with it." The response was scathing. Quote, "Wendell Berry provides writers enslaved by the computer with a handy alternative, wife. A low-tech, energy-saving device. Drop a pile of handwritten notes on wife, and you get back a finished manuscript edited while it was typed. What computer can do that?" And it goes on. Perhaps not since an anonymous 11th century monk wrote, quote, "The task of writing destroys the sight, bends the back, breaks the ribs, and pains the stomach, causes backache, and ails the whole body. Has so much emphasis been brought to bear on the sheer labor involved in the production of the written word? A manual for the Apple Writer 2, a DOS 3.3 based program on the market in the early 1980s, sees fit to include an earnestly rendered history of writing in its spiral-bound pages, which begins by evoking cave paintings as the first scribblings, and continuing on through the typewriter. This is from a technical manual. One rolled a piece of paper around the carriage, made impression upon it one at a time with inked keys, and when the space on the paper was used up, one rolled the paper out. This detailed, almost forensic description has its counterpart in accounts such as that of journalist James Fallows, who in a 1982 piece for The Atlantic, published as it happens the same year as that Apple Writer manual, begins simply, quote, "When I sit down to write a letter or start the first draft of an article, I simply type on the keyboard and the words appear on the screen." He goes on to give the specs for his machine, describes the process by which he composes and revises text. "You don't need to stop at the end of the line," he says. Saves documents to magnetic tape or disk, and finally prints them. Quote, "I load the stationery into the printer and push the print button, and then fish each piece of paper out of the printer when it is done. If I am printing a draft of an article, I can hook up my tractor feed, push the print button, and go out for a beer." Seemingly nothing about the act of writing could be taken for granted anymore. At the Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin, patrons can access an electronic file from playwright Terrence Mcnally that is a stream of consciousness rendering of his first encounter with WordPerfect in 1988. He comments on his discomfiture watching his text slide off the edge of the screen, a common concern for early users. From the minutiae of mechanisms by which ink was impressed on paper to the topological dimensions of line, page, and screen, every aspect of the written act was being parsed, rationalized, re-engineered, and re-implemented in the technology that, more than the spreadsheet and database, more than video games, was quickly recognized as the killer app of the personal computer era. So this is part 3, and part 4, you'll be happy to know, is shorter than the others. Over the course of 4 articles written between November 1981 and June 1982 for the newsstand magazine Popular Computing, none other than Isaac Asimov recounted his coming to grips with a word processor. Together they constitute an unusually candid self-portrait of a writer's encounter with the technology. He narrates the arrival of the machine on May 6, 1981, at his 33rd floor New York City apartment at the behest of the editors of Byte magazine. Why Asimov then wrote for a competitor publication is unclear. It's a Radio Shack TRS-80 Model 2. Do you have one of those, Laurie, in the Media Lab?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Accompanied by a daisy wheel printer and the word processing software Scripsit, that name recalling perhaps that anonymous 11th century monk in the scriptorium. In any case, the beginning is not auspicious. Asimov is reluctant. He professes apprehension and expresses skepticism that the technology can do anything to improve his already extraordinary output, roughly a book a month. Nonetheless, he submits and agrees to honor the experiment. He contemplates the boxes and imagines them filled with arcane incunabula. He asks us to accept that he has them stacked in a corner of his writing office and then practices navigating the space until he can be assured of avoiding any accidental contact with them, even in the dark. But that is merely prolonging the inevitable. A few days later, a technician, dispatched all the way from Radio Shack corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, arrives to set everything up. His wife, Janet, makes an appearance at this point, not as typist, but as agent provocateur, suggesting that the computer take pride of place in the living room instead of the back office. The technician agrees. The machine is powered on. The tech types some lines while Asimov watches over his shoulder. Quote, words and sentences appeared and parts were then erased, substituted, transferred, inserted, started, stopped. Dr. Asimov is then given homework. Manuals to read, workbooks to complete, tape-recorded tutorials to listen to. He confesses in his diary that night, I'll never learn how to use it. Time passes. The computer looms as an ominous presence in the otherwise tranquil domestic space of the apartment, dominating its surroundings. Quote, I had by now developed the habit of flinching when I passed the computer corner, throwing up my arm as though to ward off an attack. You must know that this is arguably the most celebrated science fiction writer of the 20th century. Gradually, however, Asimov lets his determination get the better of him and begins to experiment with the machine. On June 14th, he has the typescript of an article to revise. He transcribes it and edits it with Scripsit. And somehow, without discernible reason or explanation, everything, pardon the expression, clicks into place. I will never know what happened, this is Asimov. The day before, I had been as innocent of the ability to run the machine as I had been while it was still in its original box. A night passed, an ordinary night, but during it, something in my brain must have finally rearranged itself. Now, there I was, running the machine like an old hand. In making my corrections, I could even use my right hand on both the repeat and the cursor arrows without looking, and that little blinking devil jumped through every hoop in sight. Thus empowered, he immediately turns to revising a waiting novel in the same fashion. He whistles while he works. Perhaps channeling Twain, he declares out loud to his wife, all it takes is grit, determination, a sense of buoyant optimism, and good old Yankee know-how. This story, let us not forget, is being told by a master storyteller. It delights with the image of the awesome patriarch of the scientific literary imagination, author of the Foundation trilogy and giver of the 3 laws of robotics, humbled by the mute pile of consumer electronics in the corner of his cramped apartment. It gives us the eureka moment, and then a pitch-perfect montage of happy productivity, very near cinematic in its staging, all of it wrapped within the self-effacing charm that no doubt endeared Asimov to his readers. Asimov himself, of course, was no Luddite, but in the first essay in the series, called I Am a Signpost, he writes about his lifelong disinterest in the particulars of digital computers and other details of the late 20th century world he helped imagine into being. Like William Gibson, who has always insisted he could not have written Neuromancer, the very novel that introduced the term cyberspace, had he known anything much about computers at all, Asimov bills himself as the reluctant prophet, one whose imagination would have been hobbled, not galvanized, by any hands-on contact with the technology. By 1981, however, computers were no longer science fiction. In fact, they had already become all but quotidian, the stuff of shop talk at conventions and writers' workshops. Almost every writer of my acquaintance is using a word processor or is getting one, while I cling more or less in terror to my electric typewriter, Asimov tells us. Why then did he agree to Byte's request? The moment must have seemed ripe. The first generation of Z80 and Intel 880 8-bit microcomputers, dominated by systems from Kromenko and IMSI, had given way to so-called integrated systems, including slick, well-conceived products from Tandy, Commodore, and Apple. IBM was still only just getting into the personal computer business, and Microsoft had only just recently moved from Albuquerque to Bellevue in Washington State with a contract to produce something called a disk operating system. Their primary competition was not Apple, but a rival operating system known as CP/M. Time magazine was still a year away from declaring the personal computer its machine of the year, but in August of 1981, Time had run a brief human interest story called Plugged in Prose. No doubt inspired by the very public episode recounted earlier in that same year in the New York Times newspaper, it began, Jimmy Carter uses one. So do novelists John Hersey and Richard Condon. Every month, more writers are discarding their pencils and typewriters for word processors, technical jargon for small computers with typewriter-like keyboards, electronic screens for scanning and manipulating text, units to store information, and high-speed printers. The Time magazine story, filler though it unquestionably was, nonetheless captures a moment both familiar and strange. Other authors mentioned include Michael Crichton, Alvin Toffler, no surprise, Stanley Elkin, as well as sports writer William Brashler, who in speaking about his display writer comes straight to the point. It takes the drudgery out of writing. I correct a mistake on the screen in a second, and the printer retypes the page in 3 seconds. No more retyping the whole page by hand. Drudgery, that is, the word processor's capacity for labor saving measured out in individual seconds, was clearly one lodestar by which the new technology was to be judged. Christopher Cerf, described as a Sesame Street consultant, is even more emphatic in the article. Quote, I use my word processor to write, store notes, create, edit, and organize. It's already paid for itself. I don't need a secretary anymore. It's the most important tool writers have been given since Gutenberg created movable type. Anxieties also abound, chief amongst them the fear of a blackout. In an era before surge protectors, uninterrupted power supplies, and lithium-ion batteries, this is surely the most primal expression of the fear that writers would have had, suddenly confronted with the dead-eye stare of their empty screen, the once buoyantly bouncing cursor, that little blinking devil collapsing to a single lit cell in the center of the screen as the system died for lack of power. Asimov initially admits only modest gains. He is already a blazingly fast typist, claiming 90 words per minute. No doubt, and doubts the machine can make him any faster. But he does note that the keys are easier to depress and that they make less noise, which pleases his wife, and also allows him to hear the television while he works, first. The most salient observations, however, concern revision. As has been noted, Asimov's output was prodigious. He described himself as a one-man Book of the Month club, and there is not much hyperbole in that statement. Without diminishing his achievements, let us not forget, though, that he wrote genre fiction, by which I mean to emphasize that he worked within a particular marketplace with an insatiable appetite for product. Asimov had grown used to simply, quote, barreling along, as he puts it. When an article requires, let us say, 10 pages, I end up with 10 uncrumpled pages, he says. Errors, typos, were the copy editor's problem. The writer's job was merely to produce the copy. If one stopped to correct the errors, Asimov tells us, one starved. The result, he says, is that any page I type may smoke slightly from the heat generated by the speed, but it is also garbled. The word the is spelled in various fashions, et, eth, te, the, and so on. These are distributed with fine impartiality randomly over the page. I make few distinctions between seep, scene, and seam, or esem for that matter, and I am quite apt to mention the button of the flask when I am referring to that part of the flask at the opposite end from the top. The result, he finds, is that he receives not infrequent last-minute phone calls pleading with him to reveal the meaning of small paint, which is really small print. But then something curious happens. The more he works with the word processor, the more he finds himself compelled to proofread and correct, one might say perfect, his own text. Bang goes the F1 and the U and the F2, and cold suddenly becomes could, and no signs exist that it was anything else. I send the cursor flying up, down, left, right, and all the carts become cats and all the hates become heats, or vice versa. What's more, commas go zooming in by the thousands, and interrogative sentences, which in the old days had question marks attached at the rate of 1 in 3, now have them inserted with loving care every time. What's happening here is the redistribution of labor. Asimov, as author, is performing work that he would have previously and cheerfully seen relegated to a copy editor, subject to the occasional phone call to clarify. This is a critical point and, in fact, resonates with Wendell Berry's unwillingness to see his own domestic arrangements disturbed. Asimov, for all of his attentiveness to the impact of technology on his writing process, does not question whether he is, in fact, now spending more time with each manuscript by doing this new kind of textual work. Moreover, it seems clear from his account that his relationship, not just to the work, but to the end product, has changed. For the reward of his editorial efforts is the perfect text. Quote, I end up with letter-perfect copy, and no one can tell it wasn't letter-perfect all the time. Then I have it printed, brip, brip, brip. As each perfect page is formed, my heart swells with pride, so it's not a question of speed after all, but of perfection, he concludes. And I hope the copy editors appreciate the new me. And so there he is. He eventually did a series of marketing ads for Radio Shack for the Tandy line. Okay, so part fourth and last. Asimov, as you may have guessed, is one of a number of case studies whom the book focuses on. Vannevar Bush's 1945 As We May Think essay for The Atlantic magazine is best remembered for its description of the Memex, a hypothetical document processing station that anticipated key aspects of electronic hypertext. But the Memex only occupies a portion of Bush's text, which also foresaw technologies as diverse as digital photography and voice recognition. Perhaps its most remarkable prognostication comes at the very end, however, when Bush imagines a machine that would capture sensory input directly from the optic nerve and route it to an external textual record, thereby eliminating the middleware of manual transcription, and a secretary, or girl, as he has it earlier in the essay when describing a machine for automating dictation. Quote, the impulses which flow in the arm nerves of a typist convey to her fingers the translated information which reaches her eye or ear in order that the fingers may be caused to strike the proper keys. Might not these currents be intercepted, either in the original form in which information is conveyed to the brain, or in the marvelously metamorphosed form in which they then proceed to go to the hand? Incredible as such a notion is, I'd like to focus for a moment on the grammar. The female pronoun in Bush's writing, otherwise replete with testimony to the achievements of science and man, is not incidental. As Wendell Berry likewise understood in his own Paleolithic way, the history of word processing, like the history of writing and authorship more generally, is gendered. We have already met Eleanor Handley, who operated the magnetic tapes electric typewriter leased by Len Dayton, and thus has claimed to having typed, if not written, the first novel with the word processor. And here is Leo Tolstoy, accompanied by, as the caption has it, his 3 assistants. You can count them, 1, 2, 3. As Leah Price and Pamela Thirschwell have demonstrated, the literary secretary occupies a unique place, iconic and yet invisible at the intersection of labor, gender, and inscription. Certainly the early word processing literature explicitly captured this. The documentation and training manuals accompanying the IBM MTST portray the machine's operators as exclusively female, a convention that continues into the 1970s as systems like Lexitron Wang and eventually IBM's own DisplayWriter spread throughout the office world. Word processing through its marketing research, organizational logic, and promotional literature put a spotlight on textual labor, the materiality of production that accompanies the milling, the production, the processing of the written word. Women were promised emancipatory roles, though the reality was far different. They found the fluorescent netherworld of the word processing pool soul-crushing and left the jobs in droves. One early report on word processing to the American Management Association took appreciative note of Len Dayton's use of a word processor, describing it as an example of the technology's unexplored potential, quote, within the very private and creative world of the professional writer. If Leo Tolstoy had also had an automatic typewriter, the report's authors posited, perhaps he might have saved enough time and energy in the revisions to War and Peace to have written another masterpiece. Apparently no one ever told them about the 3 assistants, let alone about Anna Karenina. But then, in an astonishing act of erasure, the report reproduces verbatim several sentences of Dayton's own account of the technology published in the afterword to Balmer. And so you see what you see there on the screen, that's a scan of the afterword to Dayton's novel, where he talks about the role of Eleanor Handley in the production of the book. Here, however, is the passage as reproduced in the AMA report. And so the ellipses efface Dayton's mention of Eleanor Handley as the operator of the machine. In a professionally pitched text and so here you see the comparison. In a professionally pitched text filled with workplace statistics, time motion studies, and sexist prose, Take a Letter, Miss Smithers is the actual title of a section. This simply cannot be regarded as happenstance. Rather, Miss Handley, who helped edit the manuscript and thus came, in her own words, to, quote, feel a real part of the process, clearly represented an unwelcome intrusion into the private and creative world that is the sanctum of traditional literary authorship. As Price and Thrushwell Riley note in their study of the figure of the literary secretary, the opposite of genius is typist. So the authors of the AMA report obviously intuited, preferring not to despoil the image of the high-tech, high-powered novelist. Dayton was very much the Tom Clancy of his day, with the busy, busy hands of Mrs. Eleanor Handley. Today, writers' hands remain a distinct object of fascination, or at least after a fashion. On September 12th of this year, British novelist Sylvia Hartman announced that she would begin writing her new book, The Dragon Lords, live in real time in Google Docs for all the world to see. Within a day, word of her feat had gone viral, and access to the document became all but impossible due to the massive demand. But eventually, interest leveled off, leaving true fans and devotees with unprecedented access to a writer's creative process, however disembodied. The cursor, that little blinking devil, darting hither and yon, moved by the unseen hand of the author as new words and sentences coalesce out of the whiteness of the screen. The effect is uncanny, not unlike a player piano of old, or perhaps a typist composing by a direct neural stimulus without the intervention of the laboring hand. Hartman, meanwhile, has taken to broadcasting word of her upcoming writing sessions via her Twitter and Facebook accounts so her followers can tune in at the appropriate moment. Why don't we go and take a look for ourselves? And so here you see the Google Doc. She's British, and so keep in mind it's midnight right now in Britain, and I would be surprised if she's here on mine. But you'll notice there are at least a half dozen or so other people looking in on the document at the same time. So that's where I wanted to conclude. Thank you very much, and happy to take some questions.